All right, and today we're going to talk about class methods. Class methods as opposed to instance methods, which we've been using a lot of so far. And so you might not even have known that there was a name for what you were using, but there is. So we're going to look at the differences today between class and instance methods. We're going to start to explore using class methods to actually create instances of that class itself, and then distinguish some little like idiosyncratic things like distinguishing between a class and instance methods with the same name. What does that look like? How do we call those things? And so that's what we're going to explore today. So it'll be a fun lesson. So what I want to start with is let's just take a couple minutes and I want you to just look at this code here I've got. And just think about the differences, the similarities, and these two questions I have below here. So let's just take a minute to consider this. All right, so what's going on here? So what are we calling the method say hello on? So we've got our say hello right here. In Ruby, typically, and most object-oriented programming languages, we call methods on a thing. So would anyone like to help me out here and just kind of talk about like what you notice the difference between what we're calling say hello on versus what we're calling .new on? Both of these are methods that we're utilizing. Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
It looks like we're calling that say hello on that object from the user class, and then we're calling the .new on the actual class.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Thanks so much, Ben. So we're calling say hello here on a user object, so like an instance of that user class, whereas right here, we're calling this method on the actual class itself. And so this is what we're going to explore today. This top one's considered what we a class method, since we're calling that method.new on the class itself. And then say hello is considered an instance method. We're calling it on an instance of that class method. Sorry, an instance of that class. Ben, did you have was that a new hand or an old hand?
New hand. So when you do the .new, there's no like explicitly defined function that we write. So is that just kind of like a keyword for the initialize, or how does that work?
It's yeah, it is a method that's already defined within Ruby structure. So there's a .new defined for this here. Where can I show this? I'll show it a little bit later when we get into a pry session, but a class in Ruby is still an object. And so did you already have your lesson on inheritance? Yeah. So in Ruby, like everything inherits from something, and there's like a top of the tree, and then everything's inheriting. So above this this user class, actually, maybe I'll go in here. So look, I made a little social media class, which we will use this in a little bit. But if I run this playground, if I do social media user, let's see, .class, its class is class, which maybe sounds weird. But so there is a class in Ruby called class with a capital C, and .new. Actually, I don't even think .new is defined in there. I think it's defined on the level above it. And so all these classes are inheriting from each other. So .new is defined somewhere along that line within Ruby code, which already exists. And if this didn't make any sense, don't worry about it. We're going to explore that a little bit later too. Cool, let's go back here. Actually, we're going to use this as an exploration. So we're going to do some quick breakout rooms right now just to get some conversation flowing. Uh-oh, hold on. Where did your channel go? There it is. So I just popped this social media user class into your chat, and you can screen share if you want. You don't have to in this situation, but we're going to do a quick breakout rooms, and I just kind of want you to discuss these questions about what do you expect each method will do. Don't write code for these. This is just a discussion. But what would you expect each of these methods to do? What would you expect it to return? What are the differences you're noticing? If you have time, go ahead and do some like pseudocode. So just like words and talk through logic, but don't actually write any code. And we'll do that just for about 5 minutes to get that started. Any questions about what you're doing? All right, let's go ahead into some breakout rooms. Or a little bit about what you talked about. So let's start with this rating method. So we've got this social media class here, and we can instantiate with an ID and a rating here. And so, interesting. So I'm just gonna kind of call on people today for the sake of time. But Phil, if you wanted to come off mute and share a little bit, like what did your group discuss this rating method? What would that function as?
Yeah, we kind of talked that would be an instance method. Like there's nothing written there yet, so it doesn't have a function yet, but that would be an instance method where the self ones are class methods.
Yeah, totally. That's perfect. And that brings me kind of to this next point. If we talk about like syntax here. So for syntax for a class method, when we write it with that def and the method name, it's always going to start with this self dot, and then comes the method name. And that's going to be how we actually define a class method. Whereas an instance method is just going to be def and then method name, like we've been writing this whole time. So here, this is just a breakdown of our syntax for how we actually define a class method. So that's definitely what we're seeing right here. Let me do a split screen, that might help. Yep, and yeah, I know that these are not filled with any code yet, and that's totally okay. We're just talking about what right, because with Ruby, the name of our method should be a pretty clear indicator of what this method accomplishes. And this one, probably right, we would just actually write this instance method as an attr reader. It's just down here for display purposes, but this is just reading back the value of this attribute. So this is really just an attr reader, or we would move it to an attr reader. But yeah, it is just an instance method to read back the value of rating. So how about Alex, if you want to share, like what did your group discuss about this self.most popular method? What might that accomplish?
I thought that it would probably, we kind of discussed, it will create an instance of like social media user itself, and then call a most popular method, which we thought would probably be based off like max by rating.
A max by rating, yeah. So I think you're spot on there. So what it's going to do, right? It's going to maybe not create a social, like create an instance, but it might go through all the instances of social media user that exist, right? And then exactly like what you said, if we can iterate through that, assuming it's contained in some kind of collection, we can iterate through that and use max by on rating to see which of those instances is the most popular. Yeah, really good. And then how about, let me scroll to the middle of my alphabet. Joe, if you want to come off mute, what did your group discuss about this add post method?
It'll add a post to the instance of the social media user. So with
yeah. When you say to the instance, you mean like if we had, let's make a couple people here. Here you go, Joe. You could be a social media user, right? And we're going to give it some ID and then a rating, right? A 5. So you have an ID of 2 and then a rating of 5. So when you say add post, we can do like this, right? Joe
Yes.
dot add post, and then I love Turing, right? I'm just speaking for you here.
Yes.
Yeah, totally. And that is spot on, Joe. So we call this method an instance method on an instance, and then it's going to perform that function, whatever it's doing, on the specific instance we called it on. So this doesn't add, so if we had another social media user of, who else did I call on? Alex, you can be ID1 with, oh, actually, I'm going to use fake names because I'm going to give ratings. I don't want you to think I'm rating the students in this class. Okay, so Bob, we have Bob and we have Jane. So when we do this add post here on line 22, we're specifically adding a post for Bob as opposed to Jane. And here we're, I love cats, adding a post for Jane. Right? And maybe this seems a little trivial, right? This is what you've been doing all along so far, but now we want to make sure that we're being very clear and distinctive about the differences. So for example, this most popular one, what would be my syntax on line 25? Max, do you have any guesses on what my syntax would be if I wanted to call this most popular method?
Sure. I think you would do like social media user dot most popular.
Yeah. So calling the, yeah, and that is absolutely correct, right? So when I have a class method, that means I am calling it on the class itself. So now we're going to say, okay, social media user class, who is the most popular social media user instance that you have? Awesome. Thanks, Max. And then last one, this find by ID. If V, did you want to come off mute and share what your group discussed about what this method would accomplish?
I think you call the same way that you did on 25, and then it's going to search all the instances that you have available by ID.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. And so so that we're calling it again on the class itself, and then we're asking it to find, and then we pass an argument of an ID. So presumably this method would return the instance of Bob, right? Because it's finding by the ID. So it would return an instance, presumably. Gus, question.
Yeah, I apologize if you already said this and I missed it, but just like, I guess I'm trying to wrap my mind around. So like if you call like most popular, basically the class knows all of the instances that you've made of it. Like how is that stored? Like, how does it know?
Yeah, great question. And no, I have not covered this. So, but this is a really good question. And this brings me to 2 points. The first point being normally when we write code and write programs, we have a database attached to it. And you're not going to work with a database until mod 2, but there are other ways to store information. Like maybe this actually had a, I don't know, users, right? And then maybe it just stored all its instances in this array. So whenever it wanted to access all the things, it could just say, oh, I'm keeping all of my user instances in this array. So that's one way you could store it since we don't have a database right now. But this brings me to another point of responsibilities. Well, actually, before I move on to that, Gus, did that kind of help with your question?
Yeah, basically it knows it because you have to tell it to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
You've got it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Right here without a database attached, there's no like magic dust that's just going to say, oh, social media user is going to know everything. We have to write some code so that it knows how to access all those instances. Okay. Yeah, great question though. And then in mod 2, you'll start working with databases, and that's how the class will know where all the information is kept is in the table of the database. But the idea of responsibility. So there's this idea of what's called the Law of Demeter, which means something should only have a limited amount of knowledge. It should really know only about itself. And so when we think about instances versus classes, an instance, so like Bob, should only know about himself. he should only know about Bob. He knows about his post, knows about his rating, he knows his ID. But if we say, Bob, tell me about Jane, Bob's going to say, what, who? Right? And that's what we want. We don't want all these instances to know about each other. That's having too much like power. We want to have everything contained. And so the social media class itself, though, it makes sense that the social media class should know about all the instances that were made from it. So if we think of the class as kind of a blueprint or a cookie cutter, whenever we make an instance, we're making it from this blueprint. So the social media user class will know about all the instances. So when we do something like most popular, we have to ask the class, because the class is the only thing that knows about all the instances. Okay. I think this will make more and more sense as we continue to talk about it. I know it can get a little like, what are we talking about? Any questions yet about what I've been talking about what an instance should know about and what a class should know about? Yeah, Mike.
When would this usually be used in terms of like using a class method, like in the wild? Like when would we usually see this?
Yeah, definitely. And in this, it would look a lot like this. Anytime you need to access a class, like I have a class of dog here that we'll talk about, right? But the dog class knows about all the dog instances that were made. And so if we ever say, okay, I wonder who is the biggest dog that I have, then I would go ask the class that question, and that would become a class method. Whereas if I want to say, oh, just say hello, and this is a command I'm giving to a specific dog, that would be an instance method, because I just want Fido to say hello, or I just want Blue to say hello. So we would ask the class something anytime we want to know, or we need to look at or consider every instance of that class.
So a class methods usually query methods?
That's an interesting thought. I'd say a lot of times they are query methods, but we certainly can do some kind of like mass assignment where we say like, take all the dogs and now rename all their breeds to something. And we can assign that responsibility to the class since it's going to touch every single instance. But I do think, I'm trying to think like now in databases, a lot of times it is a query, but does it have to be? I wouldn't say that that's like a hard and fast rule, but I think it's an interesting thought. Sydney.
Sorry, I meant to lower my hand and Mike had the exact same question.
Oh yeah, no worries, no worries.
Can you hear me?
Do you have a different? Oh yeah, Sid.
Oh, okay, sorry,
you
my
have
mic was. I'm having issues. Is there a delay for you or no?
Well, I don't know. It seems okay on my end.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was just my question. So like you're only using this class method if you don't have instances of that class, or if you want it to apply to all instances of the class.
Yeah, or if you need to look into every instance of the class, right? Because if we look at this example here of the most popular, probably this method will return a single instance, right? It would return Jane in this case, since Jane has the highest rating. But in order to get that, to know that Jane has the highest rating, we need to look at all the instances of social media user. And so it makes sense that the class would have that capability, because the class can look into every instance of itself, whereas a single instance should only know about itself.
So also like social media knows about users. So it's kind of just to bypass having to iterate through users. Oh,
no not necessarily, because probably
ignore me.
Okay. Well, I'm
Yep.
going to keep going with the question because other people might have that question too. right? But presumably the code, and I think you froze a little bit, Sid, sorry. But presumably this code here, right, is going to go through all those users and perform some kind of max by function, right, to find the user with the highest rating. And the only reason I put this here in here is because Gus asked the question of where is this information coming from? Since we don't have a database that stores this for us right now, storing it in an array of objects is one way that we can store this information for now, especially in an instance variable, right? Because those instance variables, we add data to them, we continue to collect data. So anytime an instance of a social media user is created, it probably gets shoveled into this array, and then we can access that array. V, question.
Okay, so I just want to check if I'm following this. So 2 things. In the social media one, you would need a method that is like add users, right? To make this work.
Probably, yes.
And in the dog one, the example that you gave was like, if I want to see which one is the heaviest, but to do that, if you create a class method to do that, you're gonna have to require that as like at least an optional attribute when you create the object, right? Because otherwise you don't have that behavior.
Right. And so I'm talking a lot about some of the things I'm saying here are like speculative. So like, what if we could do this? What if we could do that? These are not fully coded out. So yeah, we would need some kind of information stored, right? There's more information about a dog than a name and a breed. Maybe it has a color and a weight and a fur type. So there could be a lot more attributes here. I'm just trying to give some examples of like concepts or ideas. But yeah, we would need to flush this out a bunch more for that to actually work like I was talking about.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah, Adam, question.
Yeah, I got a little lost when you added @users equals array, because I mean, every user, Bob and Jane, are now going to have an @users array. Why do we need that?
Yeah, that's really good. We wouldn't want it like that. Oh, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, actually.
No worries. Just was wondering
maybe,
why.
Could we do,
we can parking lot it and I'll.
No, yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I'm trying to think like of another, maybe you guys, because y'all are gonna need this. Maybe we had another class. You're totally right, first of all. And that was a poor coding on my part. We should not have this @users array in here because like Adam just said, then Bob and Jane have this random container. So that doesn't really make any sense, but we still need some kind of way to store that. Maybe there's some kind of like other repository or other class that's actually creating these instances and holding on to them for us. And then social media user could access that other class. Okay, that might be a little funky. Hold on, when do you have, oh good. So later today, you have a class called Traversing Two Verticals. And Adam, I think that class will kind of help answer your question. If that class does not help answer your question, let me know. But that is it's a really good and relevant question to what you all are going to be doing in this project, right? Because you need some way to store all these instances that you've been creating. So that could be the responsibility of a class, another class, to just store instances of social media user. So it could be like a social media user repository, right? Not in this class, but we could have another class called that, and its job would just be to store all the instances of social media user that are created. Okay, that totally got a little like off track, and that's okay. I think it's a good question, but I'm not going to continue down that path. Cool. This is fun. All right, let's look a little more at this dog class because there's some other situations that we want to consider. So we've got this method here, the say hello. And if I've got, also, if you notice here, I've got this all array, which is holding all of my instances, and we're going to utilize that in a minute to pass it into this class. so that it has all access to all these instances. It's hard when you don't have a database. But if I'm going to call this say hello method, we've already kind of looked at this. It's an instance method. I know that because it doesn't have a self in front of it. So I could just say Fido.sayHello, and Fido would say his name, right? So, but what if I wanted, like, what if some way I could talk to like the dogs themselves, and there was some kind of method where all the dogs would say their name if I called a class method. So if I had like self.sayHello, oh, can I even do that? All dogs, right? So maybe there's, for some reason, I need not an individual dog, but I need some control. All the dogs have to act, maybe they're robot dogs, and they all have to act as like one dog at this point, and they all have to say hello at the same time and say their names. So that could be a responsibility we put into the dog class, because we need it to access or control all of the instances. And so if we, how would we call this method? I know there's no code in here yet. We'll write that code. But if I'm down here on line 25, how would I call this method? Anyone want to hop off mute? I guess I could have called on someone. Yeah, Ben, go for it. Oh, sorry.
Would you do that say hello and then pass the dog class, so every instance, like everything that's within that, like every object that's a dog has to say hello?
Like this?
Is that correct?
Not quite.
Okay.
Right, because if we do that, what's the, actually, let's just run that and see what here. I think this is in my lib folder. Yeah. All right, so it says undefined methods say hello for main object, which means because right here I'm outside of the class, it's looking in that scope and it doesn't see a method called say hello. Gus, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, could you do dog.sayHello and then pass it all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here, what we're doing, because say hello is a class method, we're calling the name of the class, then calling that class method on it, and then just passing it the argument of all of these dogs. And this is a little contrived, but that's okay. I want you to just get the idea. So then in here, if we wanted all the dogs to say hello, maybe we do a little iteration. Oh gosh, each do dog. Now for each dog, oh, now I want each dog to say their name. So we could just do dog. Oh my goodness, this is so exciting. All right, actually I want to put a pry in here to show you. Because this kind of leads me to this next idea of what can we do inside of a class method. So let me hit this pry. Oh, look, I am Fido. Oh yeah, that's because on line 26 here, I have Fido saying hello. Okay. So I'm inside of a class method here, and all dogs is an array of dog instances. So I'm iterating through those. So this block variable is holding a single dog object. So when I'm inside of the block, dog is a single dog object. And I want this dog to say hello. I want it to say, hi, I am Fido. So how can I do that? Do I already have a method that I can call on a single dog object that will make that dog say hello? The answer is yes, because it happened right there, right? We did Fido.sayHello, because this method right here is an instance method. So from inside of the class method, if I'm dealing with a single instance, I could just do dog.sayHello, and it will give me, it will actually call that method on that single object, even though I'm inside of a class method. So what we can do here is do dog.sayHello. And because I'm calling this method because notice these two methods, this class method and this instance method, they're called the same thing. So how does Ruby know which one to invoke? Well, it's looking for what are you calling the method on. So here I'm calling the method on a dog instance. So it's going to go look for the instance method. Whereas down here on line 27, I'm calling it on the class. So it's going to look for a class method. Does that work? Sure does. There we go. All the dogs are now saying hello. Okay. Was that mind bendy a little bit? What questions do you have? V.
So like, unless the method, it's like a built-in method like max by, you always gonna have to have an instant method that you're gonna use inside the class method.
Any method that exists you can use. So you can either use a built-in method, you can define your own method depending on what you're doing. But yeah, this method that you call inside of here does have to exist. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
I mean, like it will always be like that. Like when you use a class method, you will have to use other methods, no matter like if you create it or it's built in, you have to use other methods in the instance of the class.
It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I would say that this pattern is very common because think about what these class methods are doing. Let me go, where's that? Oh, it's in playground, right? If we look in our social media user class, right, most popular is going to probably use some kind of iteration to go through all of the social media user instances. It's going to look across all those user instances to do like a rating, right? To say, okay, of the users, I want to find the user that has the biggest rating. So here we are doing that same kind of pattern. Same with the find, right? Maybe we're iterating through all the users and doing a find and iterating through that and finding the user by the ID. User.id is ID, right? So I would say that this pattern is very common in a class method to have to then go do some kind of iteration through all the instances. And whenever you're dealing with single instances, you're probably going to need to call some kind of instance method.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Karen, question. And then we're going to take a palm.
So I'm thinking in terms of like nested iteration. And if we have a class method that iterates through a class method that has an enumerable, how do we use that class method inside of another enumerable? Can you write something like that?
So like if you wanted to use this class method inside of an enumerable?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So we have say hello, which we're calling on the dog at the very bottom. How could we do that to like avoid writing nested enumerables?
I think that's a hard question without a specific example, just because I think it'd be very dependent upon the context. It would follow the same ideas though, like if we had some kind of nested enumerable, we can do all these things. It just depends on what we're trying to act upon. Are we acting on the class or are we acting on just an instance? So I think that I'm not sure how to display that unless we have like a specific example.
Is that like a thing, or did I just make that up?
I mean, it always just depends on what you're like, it's contextual, like what are you trying to accomplish? I think all things are legal in code. So there certainly could be a situation where you need to do some kind of nested iteration and then call a class method from inside of enumerable maybe. I think that's very possible. Maybe as we go through some more examples in this lesson, that might help get cleared up a little bit. If not, definitely like ask it again or drop it in the thread for this. Just because I think without an actual example, sometimes it's hard to think about it, but that's okay. And so, sorry, Karen, I know that didn't really answer your question. All right, for some reason, I think I need to figure out my howler timer. It went off, but we didn't hear it. So let's take a palm. We'll take 5 minutes and then we'll come back and look at some more examples. All right, I've got a question for some of you, all of you actually. What if we did this? What if there was some method like this? We were going to have some kind of new breed of dog join our ranks of dog breeds. And I don't know, some other code might happen, but ultimately when a new dog breed is added, we want some introductions to take place. So I'm going to call this method from inside this method. What method do you think would be called? So make a guess in your head right now, right? Because on say hello, I actually have 2 methods right now called say hello. One is an instance method, one is a class method. So on line 20, when I invoke say hello, what method will be called? Guess in your head. Well, let's test it. So we can test it by, let me comment these ones out. I will call, it's a class method, so I need to call it with dog.newBreed. So I'm gonna run this file, it's gonna hit new breed, it's gonna run this and then run that, and we'll see if it pops out just a single hello or all the hellos. And that'll help us know which one it did. Oh, it didn't like my thing. Say hello. Oh, okay, actually that does kind of tell you which one it tried to call, right? It erred because it said, okay, say hello, wrong number of arguments. You gave 0, but I expected there to be 1 argument from line 13. And so that means it was trying to call this method, right? Because it's expecting an argument. So I need like all dogs, which I don't have right here. And that's okay, because I'm not actually trying to code that works right now. I'm just trying to display to you what happens when you're inside of a class method and you invoke another class method. This is how we do that. You just call the name of the method, but you don't need to put dog dot, you don't need to put self dot. We just call the name of the class method. Since we're inside of a class method, if you call another method, it's going to look for a class method by that name. The difference with this one was that we were not just calling the method out in the ethers here, we were actually calling it on a dog object. So when we're just calling it here like this, it is looking for the class method. Sam, question.
So if you didn't have a instance method, say hello, or sorry, if you did not have a class method, self.sayhello, it would still not try to call the instance one, right? It would, yeah. Okay.
Yep, so it's still trying to call the class method of dog because we are inside of a class method. It's going to also look for other class methods. And if it doesn't see one defined, it's going to say, you're trying to call a method that does not exist. Great question, Sam. Sid, go ahead.
Sorry. So I guess I thought that the class was already inheriting from self. Like,
no, so self it's not inheriting from self. Let's look at what self is. And this is going to be a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I think an important one in this situation. So let's look at it. So the idea and the concept of self can be kind of mind-bendy. So if you don't get it this first time, that is okay. It usually takes a couple times of hearing about self to understand what's going on with that. So I've got my pry inside of here. Here's what I'll say, generally speaking, self, when it's not the definition of a method, but when you see self inside of a method, self refers to the thing we call the method on. Okay, self refers to the thing we call the method on. And now let me illustrate what I mean by that. So in here, if we run this, okay, so we're inside of this method. And how did we get inside this method? Well, it was invoked down here on line 33. Now, what is the thing I called this method on? Okay,
okay.
Sorry, I'm not talking to just you, Sid. I'm sorry. I'm talking to everyone. Not trying to put you on the spot. But we called it on the dog class itself, right? So if we're inside of that method, self is going to be the thing we called the method on, the dog class. Okay, so self is the dog class. Now, what Ruby's kind of doing behind the scenes is in front of every method, it automatically puts a self dot. That's why if you've written out self dot, and I've reviewed your code, I've probably told you take that out, like you don't need it. Ruby automatically puts that for you when it runs the methods, even though it's not there, that is there. And we saw that self is the dog class. So this is essentially saying dog.sayHello, which is calling that class method. Okay, now what if we put our pry into here? And how do I invoke that method? I need this one. So now we're calling the instance method of sayHello. What am I calling that method on? Let's run it. So I'm inside of that sayHello method that was invoked from line 32. What do you think self is going to be in this case? Think to yourself. Remember, self is always the thing we call the method on. So it's the actual dog instance, right? Because we call this method on this dog instance. So what's going on with this sayHello is, well, nothing else is going on in here. But if we put like name in here, we have an adder reader. So I can call this method of name, right? Which, you know, we could have done that right here. In our string interpolation, we could just call the method of name as opposed to accessing the instance variable, and that would work. And what Ruby's doing whenever you call a method, it always has to call the method on something. So it automatically puts this self dot that is implied. And then we just saw self is this dog instance. So this is kind of like doing Fido.name, but we don't want to hard code Fido in there because what if we call it on Blue or Sally? So self allows us to keep that very dynamic. So this method will apply to whatever instance we call this method on. Is that mind bendy? A little mind bendy?
Yeah, because I guess when you say it's implied, I thought that implication was coming from the fact that it was inheriting from itself. I don't know why I was thinking that in my brain, because I was thinking like if you had class dog and then you did like class inheriting from self, that would be the same thing as calling self dot in my mind.
Well, we wouldn't have this. We wouldn't have it inheriting from it.
Then after like class dog, if you did underneath that like class inheriting from self, you could call those same sayHello without the self.
I haven't seen that before, so I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, but typically this is how we're going to want to see it inside of a class. Any instance methods and class methods are all going to be within the class. And then anything that we want to define as a class method, we start with a self dot.
Okay.
If you, and Sid, if you've got some kind of like a specific example, if you want to drop it into the code help thread, we can look at it and kind of dissect what's going on with it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Any other questions right now about calling class methods from class methods or calling other instance methods from within class methods? Or too many questions to think of? Max, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about instancing the class from a class method, how that would work, and if, yeah.
I think that's what we're going to do next, actually. So what we've what I've got here is, so I've got a user class, and Max, let me know if this illustrates what you're talking about. So we've got a user class, and I've just got a simple test that it exists. And then what I want here, this next test, is that I want to test it can create multiple users. So I want to kind of do this like mass functionality of giving it a bunch of names and having the user class be responsible for taking all that info and creating a bunch of user instances. So the rest of the test, if we look through, I have here, it doesn't exist yet, but what I would like is for there to be a class method called create multiple users. I pass it a hash of information, and then what its return value is going to be stored in new users. So if I go through new users, I want it to be an array. I guess I should put that assert instance, whoops, insert instance of array. Okay, so I want it to return an array. Each element of the array, I want to be a user object. And since I'm passing in 3 hashes of information, I expect that it would have 3 instances, and then I'm just checking in that first one. I'm just digging into that first element to make sure it responds to the method of .name, and that it indeed is that first name. Okay, so that's the setup for this. Any questions about the setup or about what we're trying to accomplish? Because then I'm going to have you just take about 5 minutes to see if you can write out some of this code. Okay. So I know you don't have this code, so it's not like you can jump into a pry, but take a couple minutes and see if you could write the method, the implementation code to get this test to pass. Okay, this is good. This is the structure of the method. How would you write it over here? So either put it like in your journal, do it in a text editor, and then I'll ask for a volunteer to share out with me. But take a couple minutes and see if you can think through the implementation code. Okay, what do you think? Do you want another minute or should we discuss it? I will read the silence as let's discuss it. The Zoom is kind of like the ultimate speak up or hold your peace kind of situation, isn't it? Especially if you all are muted. So, okay. Ben, question.
Oh, never mind. Sorry.
Oh, you're all good. I was going to ask though, maybe you were answering my next question preemptively, but I wanted to ask if someone wants to share with me what they coded or what their thought process was. I do see a V. All right, V, let's do it.
So I have no idea if this makes any sense, but what I did is create the method self.create multiple users, pass the user's hash, and then inside the method, I did users key name equal user.new, and inside the parentheses users key name again. Does that make
like
any
this?
sense?
Did I type what you said?
Sorry, I was looking at my screen. Well, for the, I use the same syntax of users key name, and then inside the parentheses, I did the same thing.
Wait,
Like
I'm not, what should I change?
Copy the user's key name and put inside the parentheses. So it's missing the users
I see.
from my code.
Like this.
Yeah.
So like this?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. The only thing though, right? Let's talk through what this is doing. This is accessing the hash of users, which is this coming in, and it's this information. You're accessing a key of name and then setting an equal to a new user. So that's gonna reset the value. Okay, I see what you're doing. You're resetting the value of the string to an actual user object. This is very close because the thing is though that we still want it to return an array. And we want it to actually, what would this do? Because users access the key of name, but there's 3 keys of name.
Oh, I guess
actually,
you have to treat
this is an array. Yeah, we've got to iterate, right? Because users is actually an array coming in. So we can't call users on it like that.
Right.
Very close. Do you know how to change it?
So I think I would do each with key value, and then each do the same thing and just use key in place of the name. And
key value. So key, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. But I think that it's missing some stuff there. I don't know.
Let's look. Let's do a pry. So if we run our test, users test, okay, we're in here. So users we know is our array. Now each element of our array is a single hash though, right? So that means we don't actually have 2 of these things, 2 block variables. Maybe we call this info, maybe because one element's going to represent that info. And V, thank you so much for helping me. I know I put you on the spot a little bit there, and you're so dang close, right? And so now if we put this, let's put the pry back in here and see what info is. Right, so now info is this key value pair. So now we can take info and grab the name out of that. We see it's cat. And that's exactly what we need to pass into our initialize to actually instantiate a user. So we can go here and then do what you had mentioned, V, is do user.new and then pass it the actual name. And maybe actually because we want this to return an array of user objects, maybe we actually make this a map so that it's mapping new user instances onto the new array so that the return value gives me actual user instances. Adam, question, comment, concern?
Yeah, in this case, could you do user.new parentheses info.value, or is that bad practice given we might have hashes that are longer?
I would say to always be as specific and explicit as possible. So if we know the name of the key we're looking for, yet let's use that instead of dot values, just because we don't know if other information might come into this or this hash, especially in mod like 2 and 3, as you start working with larger and larger crazy data structures. Very rarely will you have a hash structure that only has one key value pair in it. So we want to get in the habit of being very specific and explicit about what it is we're expecting. Great question. Yeah, Catherine.
Yeah, I have a question about in line 9 where it says info. Would we be able to put in two, are those arguments, two pieces of information in there? Can we do like key and and name, and then for user new, just put V, or whatever we call it?
Well, let's see what we've got here. So, right, because users is an array, but each element of that array is a hash.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so if you see key is the element, and then V is nothing.
Okay.
Right, here's where this is getting confusing, because if we were iterating over a hash, we would have two block variables, one representing the key, one representing the value. But since we're actually iterating over an array, each element gets a single block variable. And it just happens, though, that the block that it's holding a hash itself.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that that can be a little confusing, so I'm glad that this question got answered and asked and fleshed out. James, question.
Kind of question, just kind of clarification. Where you're having user.new, you talked earlier about it calls a self on itself. So you don't even need the user there. Because I did self.new and then I deleted the self. So if you just have new info name, it will put the self there.
Yep, sure will. Thank you for pointing that out. So remember what I mentioned earlier with the self, right? That self dot is always implied in Ruby whenever you call a method, and .new is a method. So when we have the self in here, do you remember what self is? I mean, you probably know because we had it there before, but let's see if we hit that pry again. If I type self in here, here's where maybe it sometimes gets a little confusing, is that I'm inside of a block that's dealing with instance. Actually, this is dealing with hashes, but self always refers to the thing we called the main method on. And we called this on the actual user class over here in the test. Oops, right here, I mean. And so self is still going to be that user class. So self.new is actually, it's always implied, so we don't need it. So yeah, you could totally call just new info.name. You know, it's weird though, whenever we see a .new, usually you see this listed with it. I'm not actually sure why, but this works just fine. Cool, thank you for pointing that out. All right. James, is that a new hand or old hand?
Sorry.
Okay, Aiden, go. You're good. Aiden, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question kind of linking onto the last one. So is the reason why self is still user in that situation because map is like an enumerable code block, not like a method necessarily? Like why doesn't, I guess I'm wondering why the scope of self doesn't change in that situation.
Yeah, because it has to do with the original method we called this on, right? Which is create multiple users. So we're inside of that method. Anytime we're inside of that method, self is going to be the original, whatever the thing was we called the method on. If you think about the .map, that method is defined somewhere else. So if we had a pry in the definition of the .map method, then when it hits here, self in that method would be users, would be an array. But because we're still inside of this create multiple users method, self will always refer to the thing we call the method on.
Okay, so my follow-up question. Yeah, it totally does. But I guess my other kind of question with that would be like, what if we're in a situation where we like are calling another method inside of this, so like maybe a helper method or something, would self, like the value of self, transfer to the new method as well?
That's a great question. And no, it's gonna, because self is always contained within the method. So if you call another helper method, well, it depends, because if you had another like a class method here, like just say, I don't know, let's just use that say hello example, right? And that was some kind of another class method. Well, self inside of, oh gosh, self inside of this, right? This is still calling self here, which self we just saw is the actual user class. So it means self would still be the user class inside of this one.
Okay.
So it really depends. If you've ever got like a situation though, where you're really curious about it, just put a bunch of like binding.prize and type self and see what self is. And that is a really good way to illustrate to yourself what you're dealing with, but you don't need to use that self keyword very often.
Thanks.
Max. Yeah, Max, question?
Yes. I have a question on when you would want to do this class method for like creating multiple users, why you would put it in this class as opposed to some other class that was like, that would call create multiple users as a method in that class. Does that make sense?
Like a use case, I think if you had some kind of maybe like an input, like a form that users could fill out, and they could like sign up for accounts, and they could, you know, sign up multiple people at once. Maybe that information then gets sent to your app. And then when it gets sent to your app, maybe you've got like a runner file or something that brings that in. This will probably make more sense in mod 2, but with something that brings that in with all the info and then says, okay, user class, here's all the info. Now go make a bunch of instances out of this information. I don't know if that answered your question.
So sorry, are you saying it's just to kind of keep that creation within the class itself for organization purposes?
It has more to do with like the responsibility, like whose responsibility should it be to create instances of user? Should it be the user class itself? Or should it be like, I mean, it's not going to be like the dog class, or sometimes you might have that like in a runner file, but should it be the runner file's responsibility to actually do this function, or should it be encapsulated in the user class? And I'm kind of asking just like hypothetical questions here. And these are things we like to consider when we're creating new methods, like whose responsibility should this be? Who should be in charge of this functionality? Maybe it's user. Maybe you've got another, like we had mentioned earlier, like a user repository that stores users. But I would, or that maybe you have a user class, but then another class is job to actually like create users based off of the template of a user. This is, I know, is this too vague? And again, I think this is an awesome question. It kind of goes along with the question that I think Adam asked earlier. I think the Traversing Two Verticals class today is going to help you with that question as well, because we're going to talk a lot about this same thing, like whose responsibility is it to do this action, and whose responsibility is it to do other kind of like statistical calculations? Whose responsibility is it? And that's what we really want to think about. And that's something that like when you get onto a dev team, you have meetings that are hours long discussing just this type of thing, like whose responsibility is this? And that's just all part of the architecture and design of code. Maybe that was a really unclear answer to your question, but hopefully it helps
I think
a little
that
bit.
helped clear some things up in my brain. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. And again, hopefully the class leader today will really help too with this idea, because I know this is a little like out there. So cool. So we're a little short on time, but I do want to get to this activity and some of that pre-work that I had posted in your Slack channel before class. If you didn't get to that pre-work, that's okay. You can work with your breakout rooms to kind of either get that information or just share a screen. But this is what we're going to do. So you've got this, we're going to play with some CSV data and kind of mimic a database, since we don't have a database. So we've got this CSV data, which you're probably a little bit familiar with working with at this point because of your project. But this CSV data is baby names, popular baby names, and the years and all of that good stuff. So what we want to do is, oh, I have to give you your assignments. Okay. We're going to play with this and accomplish some tasks. And so you've got this file created, a class of name. We've got, oh, okay, this is what, and someone mentioned this in the this thread. This is, see how there's two @ in front of this variable name? So this is not an instance variable. An instance variable has a single @. A class variable has two @. Now here's what I'll say, a disclaimer in the beginning is we typically do not like to use class variables because their scope is larger, so it can create some issues in like what was the definition of that, and maybe some collisions if you name another variable name that same thing as the class variable name. So typically we don't use class variables, but for the sake of this demonstration, we are. And so the scope of a class variable is within the entire class. And you can see it's defined outside of anything else because it belongs to the class, not an instance. And so here we're just naming this for this CSV. And then when we do the CSV method of read, we're passing in that file name. So I guess we don't actually, like, we don't really need it, but it's just going to make it so you don't have to type popular baby names over and over again. All right, so what is this doing? Find by name. Your first task is going to be to build a method with your team that will go through the CSV data and given a name like Megan, to find all the names or all the, you're going to create instances, a name instance. You're going to find all the name instances that match this name. That's going to be your task. But what I want to show you here first is how this data comes in. So if we put a pry in here, because I think sometimes working with CSV data can be kind of funky. Let's call, oh, this is name. It's in lib. All right, so we're in our pry right here inside of our class method, find by name. And it takes in a name. So we can see here the name is Megan, and that's what we're looking for. But let's look at this rows, because rows is what's read through the CSV data and pulled some information in. Well, that's not too helpful, is it? So it's just like this weird CSV table mode, something funny. So here's where I'll give you some like hints. So rows, if we did something like 0, right, which is how we maybe would query an array, then we can see the first element of this rows variable it's a CSV row object, but what else does it look like? Like if you look at the structure of this, what data structure are you reminded of? Any ideas? You can just come off mute and shout it out.
Like a hash?
Totally, looks like a hash. And here's the cool thing in Ruby, if it looks like a duck and it talks like a duck, then it's a duck, right? So if it looks like a hash and will respond to hash methods, we can treat it as a hash. So if rows 0 gives us some kind of hash, then we can access things like a year of birth via the key and get that data. Okay. But presumably we want to do this for all the rows, right? Because row 1 is a different one, and then rows 2 is a different element. And so in this array, each element can be thought of as a hash, very similar to this user thing that we did, right? Where users came in as an array, and each element of that array was a hash that had information in it that we could query by the key to pull the data we needed to actually instantiate the object. So that's what you're going to be doing here in this name, right? We need all this data to instantiate a name object. So where can we get all this data from? From right here, okay. From this rows object, okay? And we can treat it as an array so we can iterate over it. And then doing this just demonstrates to you that each element can be treated as a hash, and we can query that hash using hash query methods. Oh goodness. To pull out specific information. If this is a little confusing, that is okay. I'm going to give you time with your group to kind of get dirty in that and play in this to figure out how to accomplish this. Let's take just a short palm though. Well, short, they're always short, right? Let's just take 5 minutes though. We've covered a lot of brain bendy stuff. So let's take 5 and then we'll come back together and play in breakout rooms. All right, we're coming back. And we're going to spend some time. I did drop the tasks in your Slack channel. And I do know that this particular exercise can be a little confusing at first until you start to get into it. So I recommend when you first get into your breakout rooms, have someone screen share, whoever's got all the data. If you don't have all the data, that's okay. You can work on either downloading it either now or later. But drop a pry in here and just kind of do these things that I was doing to explore the data that you have access to. So remember, rows, essentially you can think of that as an array. Each element of the array is a hash or a hash-like structure. It will respond to hash methods. And so we want this method here to return instances. So we don't want it to return CSV data, we want it to return name instances. So you do have to work on instantiating as well. Okay, all right, so I will pop around the rooms to see if people have questions, but I'm gonna go ahead and open those up now and we'll spend some time working through those tasks. Any questions before we pop into our rooms? All right, because this is a slightly confusing one, please work together and communicate and talk about it. All right, have fun. All right, welcome back. Was that fun? A little bit. Cool. So I just want us to, we've got a couple minutes left here, but I want us to just go over maybe 1 or 2 of these methods to explore pulling in the CSV data. What I'll say here too is because, rows we looked at is an array and each element of this array is a hash. And I really wanted to make sure though that results returned an array of instances. So anytime you're working in an object-oriented language such as Ruby, you want to try to work with instances or objects as much as possible, because that's the whole idea. A lot of times people will say, oh, I love hashes. Let me just stick everything into a hash and I'll keep this a hash structure going forever. But that does not utilize the idea of object-oriented programming. I think you've been learning about some of the principles along the way, but in hashes, we can't use encapsulation or abstraction. We want to be able to have methods defined in classes and then be able to call those methods on the objects that are inside of this array. So it's important to be instantiating our CSV data into actual objects. So does someone want to come off mute and share what their group did, the code that you put inside self.findByName to actually perform this task? Happy to call on a group.
I can walk through this one, Kat.
Okay, James, go right ahead.
So with what you have set there right now, we just did rows.select, then do row.
Okay.
And then we used an if statement. If the row child's first name as the key equals name, then we shoveled that row into the result array.
Then why did you use the select?
Because we were going through and just selecting all of the rows that had the matching name. I don't know, we could use something else.
Well, those are synonymous. So, but my point is so you did if the row and oh shoot, what is it? The name,
Yeah,
the
child.
child's. So if this was equal to the name that was passed in as an argument, then
Results, and then shovel a new with the argument row.
okay, so then you instantiated.
Yeah.
Right. And so all I'm saying is if all you're doing is shoveling things into an outside accumulator.
You just use like each. Yeah.
Totally. Yep. I think select or find all could work if you did this code a little bit differently. But this is totally fine. I like the dot each here, since especially because we set this up with an outside accumulator. So you could have changed that and not used it and used a find all instead. But I like this. And so we're checking if the row, because remember each element of this array is a hash-like structure. And so we can call on the hash, we can find the key. And if the return value of that is equal to the name that we passed in, then go ahead and turn that CSV row data into an object, a name object, and pass it into the results array, and then we get that back. So if we look at that here, maybe here, let's just save this to a variable so we can look at it here. So if we run name, perfect. So results is a bunch of name objects now. And we can do, presumably they're all with the name Megan. So we can count those. Oh, no S on that. And you see we've got about 10 Megans. I might have older CSV data than some of you if my numbers don't match. This happened last inning too. Cool, that looks great. V, question, go ahead.
Why didn't you, why don't you need on line 23, why don't you need to do like the name of the class .new?
Yeah, great question. So you certainly can. A lot of times I actually see this when it's coupled with .new, I'll still see the name of the actual class. This is not incorrect. This is totally fine. You could do this, it will function the exact same way. But what James did here was whenever a method is called inside of a method in Ruby, there is an implied self dot in front of that method name. Self in this whole method, self refers to the class of name, right? So it's kind of the same thing. Doing this is the same as if you did self.new, which is the same as if you just put new.
Yeah, and you did talk about that. Sorry about that.
That's okay. This stuff is so like, what the heck? Like we're gonna have to hear it a couple times for it to really stick. So I'm glad you asked that question. Max, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, can you just go over again the advantage to instantiating instead of just putting the whole row into there?
Instead of like CSV data?
Right.
So now results is an array of name objects. So now we have the ability to do a whole bunch of other things with it, right? So if we've got our results here, we can then perform any other kind of Ruby functions on it if we wanted to, like results dot maybe we want to do a map and it's a name object, so we can then use our object-oriented programming skills of calling a method on this object of like the name, right? And now we can do that kind of thing. So it allows us to utilize like calling the methods with this dot notation and doing anything else that we can do with objects. Because could you do, if name was a hash, could you do this? Yeah, you can. You could use a key, like the bracket notation, but then you're losing all the benefits of object-oriented programming. So I want you to remember of those principles that we talk about in object-oriented programming. Have you had that class yet? Maybe not. Principles of OOP? Not yet? Okay, well, we'll talk about it. And so there's a lot of benefits, like when we create a class, if we need to know any of the methods, we want this name object to respond to something really funky, that maybe just a simple hash wouldn't respond to, we can put that method in the class, define it there, and now that we have a name object, we can utilize that method. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Max. But we definitely, when possible, want to instantiate rather than just throw everything into a hash structure. V, is that a new hand or an old hand? Old hand, okay. Sam, go ahead.
Can you have a module be able to access like class variables because it's included in the class. So you can have like a hash of a list of names as a class variable.
I'm gonna strongly, yes, you can. I'm gonna strongly recommend that you don't use class variables as a general rule of thumb. They can get funky in terms of scope, and then they also get away from this idea of making things as local as possible to either the instance that they need to be used in, the method they need to be used in. What you can do, and what you might see in a lesson later today, is like if this is holding like a list that's holding on to something, and you've got another class that you can create a list instance variable, then your module can access this instance variable of a list and perform a function over that list. And that might kind of help with this idea of sharing that information. I don't know if that answers your question, Sam. But I'm going to strongly, okay, kind of.
No, it answers my question. I was going to say, like, I thought that it'd be a management purpose to keep it as a class variable, but actually just instantiating a list from the name object makes more sense, actually.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and again, I'm going to discourage people from using class variables as much as possible. Very rarely do you actually see them in Ruby. Other languages will utilize those a little bit more, but in Ruby, we want to keep everything what's called encapsulated. So like, you know, if each of these methods is like a little envelope, we want all the information for that envelope to be enclosed within that little envelope. We don't want it like all over the place. We don't want a bucket of envelopes with all the information all over the place. Cool. Well, that was a fun analogy. Any questions about anything we covered today? Okay, cool. So just to do a very quick recap, we talked today about our class variables and our syntax for making a class variables. I'm sorry. Nope. We talked about class methods today. To create a class method, to define it, we throw that self dot keyword in the method name definition. To call a class method, we call it on the class itself. And typically speaking, our class methods are going to be responsible for doing something with all the instances, rather than an instance method, which is concerned with just acting upon a single specific instance. Okay, and then we also utilized some CSV. You might use the dot read or the dot for each method, maybe in your projects. And then we accessed that information to build some kind of queries. If you have time, going through some of those other tasks that I had in your Slack channel is a fun practice. And if you're able to do that, you'll see some fun correlations in Mod 2 when you start working with databases. Cool. So this is recorded. If you have further questions,